Later, Minnie suffers a similar fate. Holmes goes back to the fair. Often. A con man artistry that he had been cultivating. All of a sudden it meshed perfectly with the fair. He had cultivated it and he had perfected it. And he could lure women into his wicked, eventually tragic world. There was an occasional report that people were disappearing in Chicago at an alarming rate. There were enough reasons to suspect that someone had done something that was perfectly legitimate and simply had been out of touch for a while. Over the fair's 6-month duration, the turnstile goes round 27 million times. The fair is drawing the largest crowds ever assembled in U.S. history. Eventually, stories begin to pop up in the Illinois papers about women who go to the fair and then disappear. The World's Fair ends in October of 1893. It's been a tremendous success. And the world, even New York, has to admit it has been the greatest fair of all time. But the dark side of Chicago casts a shadow over what were to be brilliant closing ceremonies. Shortly before the fair is set to end, Chicago's mayor is killed by a crazed Irish immigrant. It brings the fair, in effect, to a metaphoric end. All the festivities that were planned, everything is cancelled. So there's this tragic end to the fair. Without applause, the fair quietly vanishes like a fairy tale that has come to an end. One by one, the bags were packed. One by one, the lights went off. It was a once-in-a-lifetime. Once in a planet's 6 months. I love to think of someone saying, and blowing a kiss to the Ferris wheel, to one of the buildings, to their memories. But God knows all the people who visited the place took away memories that I've got to believe they had in their head on their dying day. It was magic. The devil that has preyed on the White City is gone. 2. With creditors hot on his trail, Holmes flees Chicago after the fair, eventually making his way to Philadelphia. He brings with him a business associate, Benjamin Petetzel, and an insurance scam that served him well in the past. The two men will take out a life insurance policy on Petetzel, fake Petetzel's death, send him into hiding, and substitute a cadaver. Then all they have to do is wait for the $10,000 in insurance money to come in and split it. But Holmes being Holmes has a twist to the arrangement. Very important element that Petetzel didn't get was that Petetzel, as it happens, was going to be the victim. And so Holmes kills him. And in a particularly diabolical way. He killed him in a way that distorted his facial features. That burned him. So it looked like it might have been an accident. Insurance investigators get a tip about Holmes' insurance scam. Holmes has made his first mistake. He's been talking about his cons to some new pals. By November 1894, Holmes is behind bars for insurance fraud. But he keeps his cool. The investigators don't know anything. Really. And there's a lot to know. In his prison cell, a confident Holmes wins the trust of his guards. The guards liked him very much. They spent time with him. They traded stories. They gave him favors. He was a great prisoner. He settles in and begins to write his autobiography. Come with me, if you will, he writes, to a tiny, quiet New England village. While Holmes paints a picture of a young man born and raised in a small New England town, detectives begin to uncover the true extent of his crimes. Unsuspecting business partners and innocent young women aren't Holmes' only victims. 3 of Benjamin Petetzel's children are missing. And detectives think the man writing about his childhood memories has something to do with it. The search for the Petetzel children becomes a national sensation. And along with the rest of the country, Holmes follows it in the daily papers. Still confident his tracks are well covered, he finds the search entertaining. In fact, Holmes had taken the children before he ended up in prison. He'd played an elaborate game of hide-and-seek with them, promising reunions with their mother, then snatching them away. In 1895, the bodies of Alice, age 15, and her 11-year-old sister Nellie are found buried in the basement of a house in Toronto. Hundreds of leads later, the body of their 8-year-old brother Howard is discovered in the chimney of a house in a small Indiana town. News of the children's deaths splatters the front pages of newspapers across the country. If Holmes is capable of killing children, what else has he done? And where? In Chicago. A question crosses at least one policeman's mind. What if? The police begin their search of Holmes' World's Fair Hotel in July 1895. What they discover there takes their breath away. In the hotel that Holmes has designed and built, behind the mask of retail stores and rooms for World's Fairgoers, they find a sophisticated torture chamber. There are airtight rooms where Holmes suffocated his victims. Certain rooms had iron walls. He had gas lines running into there where he could turn on natural gas, all of which was controlled from his suite. A grease chute runs through the house and into the cellar. There's a dummy elevator, trap doors, a floor of 35 rooms and 51 doors designed to confuse terrified victims. He's able to construct a building that has effectively a torture chamber in the basement, a crematorium, hidden passages, all kinds of things that allowed him to prey upon fairgoers who stayed there. It had to be heart-stopping for the police, who I'm sure had never encountered anything quite like that. They go down into the basement and then it all became clear. There are quicklime pits and acid vats used to disintegrate bodies beyond recognition. There was a dissection table there with surgical instruments that was stained in what appeared to be blood. And worse, remnants of hair, bones and clothing. They said, "Oh my God. There's more here. He obviously has done something far worse than that. We're finding remnants every place here. We've got a serial killer on our hands. It's all over the papers. It's one of the great crime stories of the 90s. It happened like you peel an onion." They'd find more and more evidence. The Chicago Tribune calls it a murder factory. The discovery stuns the entire nation, including Dr. H. Holmes. Pacing in his prison cell, Holmes is beginning to worry. Newspapers are reporting the police's grisly discovery at his World's Fair Hotel. He was stunned. He had to be stunned because he thought he would get away with it. Every psychopath thinks he's so smart, so brilliant. He's going to get away with everything. Finally, it seems the serial killer is about to crumble. His secrets have been exposed. The depth of his evil seen. There are no more cons to be done. No more young women to lure to their deaths. The true number of people he killed remains a mystery. There are 9 for sure. But speculation is all over the map. The number could be in the several dozen. Could be in the hundreds. Nobody knows. In November 1895, Dr. H. Holmes is sentenced to death by hanging. When it becomes clear to him that he's going to die, Holmes begins to write a confession. It seems a fitting time, if ever. He writes, to make known the details of the 27 murders of which it would be useless to longer say, I am not guilty. The need for notoriety. The narcissism. To try and control it. This is what all those writings were about. The autobiographies and the changing stories and all of that was to make him feel important and to try to keep manipulating and controlling people and thoughts and systems. It never ends. It just never ends. Until they eventually end. I was born with a devil in me. He writes. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer. No more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing. Not only is he a killer, he's the most notorious serial killer ever. And he, you know, claimed to doing hundreds of crimes and all of this. And then the next time around it was. No, then he had backed off of that. Now he's down to maybe 27 murders that he might have done. On May 7, 1896. Holmes' reign as one of America's first serial killers ends. He composes himself and walks his final steps to the hangman's gallows. There's a rumor that his guards weep they've grown so fond of him. It's 9 days before his 36th birthday. For his final act, Holmes asks to be buried encased in cement. In effect, the grave was. It was a double grave. 10 feet deep. Deeper than normal. The coffin was filled with cement. And then the coffin itself was buried in cement. The serial killer had been frantic in making the request. A doctor had asked to study his brain after his death. To see what had made him into such a villain. He was just so mortified at the idea that someone might dissect his body or desecrate it in some way. Finally, the man who terrified so many in his lifetime had felt his own terror. Holmes is buried in a Catholic cemetery. Holy Cross. Just outside of Philadelphia. 3 years earlier. On a similar May Day. The World's Fair had opened in Chicago. And he'd been there to take all he could from it. If there had been no fair, I think he would have murdered people. Probably not as many. It might have not gone as undetected as long as it did. Because he exploited the chaos that was the fair. And all of the tumultuous comings and goings of people. And the lack of police ability to take a look at this. And they were distracted with all the other things that were going on. In Chicago. The hotel that had held the depth of his darkness became a curiosity. When the story breaks in Chicago that there's been a serial killer living right there among them. Has been renting out rooms for the World's Fair. Has been the local pharmacist. I'm sure many people were just astounded. How could this happen? How could this happen in our town? In our neighborhood? How could this happen to this level? And we had no clue. A promoter talks about turning it into a tourist attraction. There's even a name. The Horror Castle. But before it can happen, the World's Fair Hotel burns to the ground. Police suspect arson. They think someone wanted the hotel and its secrets wiped away. By the time the ashes cool, the horror that took place here during Chicago's finest hour is fading from the city's memory. Along with the name H.H. Holmes. 20th century cities like Chicago have no room for skeletons in their history books. I think that one reason he fell from the national consciousness is probably because of the Gilded Age. Probably because this was a time when everybody expected such great things. In a way, Holmes was too dark. He didn't fit into the plan. He didn't fit into the Gilded Age scheme of things. After the fair, Chicago returns to the real world and the duality of the Gilded Age. An economic depression coming over the United States really hasn't affected Chicago much because so many people are attending the fair and they're pumping lots of money into the local economy. When the fair is over, though, the depression falls on the city. Unemployment skyrockets. And within just a few months of the fair, you have large numbers of homeless people who are living on the fairgrounds. Then comes the fire that destroys it all. 100,000 people come to watch the White City burned. To see the final performance of the fair. Like a mirage. The fair and its White City disappear from the front pages of the newspapers and retreat into history books. But Chicago has won its place on the world map. It was a kind of phenomenon on its own. A little town that they didn't think could do it did it better than it had ever been done before. I think every city has its quintessential moment. When everything seems to come together and announce the fact that we've arrived as a world-class city. For Chicago, that year was 1893. The World's Fair introduced the country to a world of electricity and technology. To beautiful cities. And to hundreds of innovations that would offer them a better life. In some ways, both the fair and Holmes were harbingers of what was to come. America would soon be called the land of opportunity. Its cities fused by rich and poor. And serial killers would be drawn to them. To hide in the chaos.